Welcome to Weekend Office Hours with Professor Paul Deneri. My name is Sirish Pulusani. Welcome back, Paul, and some more big news this week as well. I'm going to start off with what's directly in the news right now, which is the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. Yep. These are the major pipelines coming out of Russia. I think they supply Europe to some degree. And their gas pipelines, they have been sabotaged. It definitely looks like they have been sabotaged. Yep. What's up in the air is who the hell has sabotaged them? So there's a lot of theories here back and forth. Give us your insight.
Well, I don't know anything that you don't know, which is the pipeline suddenly lost pressure. That was the first thing anybody noticed. Then they noticed this bubbling of gas up to the surface of the Baltic Sea. And this is actually in Danish territorial waters. And then they went back and looked at seismograph readings that showed there had been a couple of sizable explosions. And so somebody basically, I mean, these are pipes that are, I think, 10 or 12 inches thick of steel and then covered with concrete. So it would take a fairly good-sized explosion to burst them, but somebody appears to have done it. Everybody wants to know who. I think the obvious suspect is Russia.
Why? Can't they just turn off the pipeline? Why would they need to sabotage their own pipeline unless Putin is playing some sort of 4D chess over here? What does he need to do that for?
No, I think you've nailed it, which is while in some senses they're the logical culprit, there's another respect in which it makes no sense. The question is, does it make any sense that anybody else would have done it? And we don't really have a good suspect there either. So
Ukraine doesn't have any incentive to blow up this pipeline?
Let's think about this. I think so Ukraine, I'll tell you why Ukraine would not do it is that the colder Europe gets this winter, the more the Ukrainians are worried that the Europeans are going to stop supporting them. So it's as much as Ukraine was against the building of the pipelines in the first place, not clear to me that it's a good thing for the Ukrainians for them to be closed now.
Okay.
Unless again, the idea is just to ramp up the overall point of crisis. Let me tell you why I think. Oh, go ahead.
No, that makes complete sense. I think just based on what you said, we could rule out Ukraine, actually.
Now, I have this. I don't even call this a theory. It's kind of a conjecture or speculation that Putin sees himself differently than we see him. I mean, that part's probably pretty true. But in this specific respect, which is that I think Putin, through some of the things he has done, for example, the mobilization, but also some other things, including maybe blowing up these pipelines, feels like he is sending very unambiguous signals to the West that say, we're serious about this, right? Basically trying to show us as clearly as he can that if we don't figure out some other solution, he will do something really scary and dramatic like drop a nuclear weapon. Now, if he were blowing up the pipelines as a way of conveying that, it, of course, would be valuable if he said, oh, and by the way, I blew up the pipelines because I'm trying to send you a message. So it's very unclear.
Yeah, I was about to say, they have denied it. They said it's crazy to even think that they did it. Is there another state actor like China or even the United States? I mean, not to bring them like who else could be on the world stage? Because it does require, like you said, these are huge, thick pipelines. Yep. It requires explosives. It could require some sort of submergible, a submarine or something like that. The forensics will actually identify what actually caused this, and we'll be able to probably find out to some close degree who was actually capable of something like this.
Yeah, I think sooner or later we'll probably get a much better idea. Russia denied it. These are the same Russians, of course, that said they weren't going to invade Ukraine. They're the same Russians who said they didn't shoot that plane down in 2014. I mean, these folks sort of lie before they get out of bed in the morning, just as a matter of principle. So what's the United States incentive? Again, I'm not sure the United States has any incentive at this point in time to exacerbate the energy crisis in Europe. If the United States were going to blow these pipelines up, it would have made probably more sense to do it 5 years ago. So I'm just
trying to give the Twitter conspiracy theorists a voice here by bringing them up. I realize it's improbable for the United States to do something like this, but
it doesn't really make sense for anybody to have done it. I will say this. It makes sense in one respect for Russia to have done it. Is instead of the Russians getting blamed for cutting off the gas, the Russians can now claim to their, the people who in Western Europe who were inclined to believe them, we didn't cut off the gas, right? The Americans sabotaged the pipelines. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's what it is. It's meant to put the screws on Europe while taking some of the blame for putting the screws on Europe away from the Russians. Mm-hmm. That would be my best estimate.
Are they losing money off of this, the Russians, that the gas supply is more limited from this pipeline? I mean, I guess that's a deal.
Gas sales to Europe have historically been a huge revenue source for the Soviet Union and more recently for Russia. The Europeans in the medium to long term, because of this invasion, have been planning to wean themselves off of Russian gas. But of course, the Russians have done that more quickly, have put pressure on them more quickly. Mm-hmm. Essentially, what the Russians are saying is, we think the Europeans need the gas more than we need the money.
Mm-hmm. Which makes sense. It just really just does make sense that the fact that it doesn't make much sense actually makes more sense that Russia did this. That's one way to think about it, right? And like I said, there's a forensic investigation happening, so they will get to the bottom of what actually happened here, I'm sure, fairly soon. That being said, last week we talked about the mobilization. Putin mobilized 300,000 reservists, likely going to be much, much more. How has that been going over the past week, and how is this being received in Russia?
It's not very popular. Lots of people leaving Russia. And again, I think from Putin's perspective, that's a benefit as well as a cost, which is Putin has mentioned a couple of times previously, sort of the idea that this war will cleanse Russian society of the decadent elements, by which he means people who believe in democracy. And so he might be okay with those kinds of people leaving. Economically, of course, it's going to be a huge brain drain because it tends to be the most well-educated people who have the means to leave the country. I think that in the short term, from what we can tell, a lot of people are trying to evade this draft, but a lot of people are basically don't feel like they have really any options, which is to say they don't want to become outlaws. They're not going to flee the country. They've got families for whatever reason they don't want to flee. They're not going to go into hiding. They might not have enough money to bribe a draft agent, and so off they go. Mm-hmm. How well are they going to fight? How, enthusiastically are they going to fight? Well, we'll see. Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the most controversial recent figures in history, Edward Snowden, got recently made given citizenship by Putin, which is interesting. Like, is this guy being drafted now? Like, what is the political play here? And Snowden, who kind of, essentially leaked a bunch of documentation regarding the NSA and surveillance, is now literally a citizen of probably one of the most heavily surveilled states and authoritarian regimes on the planet.
Yeah, it's not a great look for Snowden. I actually think, he when he started this process a while back, he basically said, "I'm doing this so that I can move around and travel and stuff like that." And I think that's actually a reasonable explanation, which is he held U.S. citizenship, but couldn't go anywhere with it because he sort of, his passport had been revoked and all this kind of stuff. So from a practical perspective, I think it was probably important for him to get citizenship in some country other than one that was trying to put him in prison. And so I actually don't think there's more to it than that. It might be that it's announced at this point in time as a way for Putin to remind, people in the West, especially in the left. It's like, don't forget, we're the ones who saved your guy Snowden from getting imprisoned by the Americans. But, there were some Americans, some enthusiastic Americans, who moved to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, because they were going to help build socialism, and didn't turn out that well for a lot of them. Mm-hmm. But I don't think Putin has any particular agenda for Snowden.
Mm-hmm. Everything just seems like a political move, right? And maybe that's easy for us to say, like sitting here, but nothing just seems sincere for the sake of it. For the sake of it,
I think that's the game that Putin plays. It's
that's the game.
Everything you do to try to gain something.
Mm-hmm.
Or every situation, what you ask yourself is, how can I use this to my advantage?
Mm-hmm. So as far as the Russian people, I think you told me earlier there's a new poll that's out. I'm very curious. I mean, just from us looking on the outside, it's very easy to imagine that this is a horrible situation for Putin. His popularity is going to drastically drop. But what is the sense that we get of what's actually taking place on the ground over there?
Well, I think as Russia becomes more and more authoritarian, we have less and less a sense of what to do with the polling data. But the poll released, it was either today or yesterday by the Levada Center, which is a good polling outfit in Moscow, but it's just limited now by the realities of the situation. Basically showed that Putin's popularity had dropped by a couple percentage points since the announcement of this draft. However, it is still in the 70s. It's still at a level that most American presidents or Western leaders would kill for. And of course, he literally is killing for it. So if we take it at face value, what it says is, it had made a little bit of a dent in his popularity, but his popularity is still so high that it doesn't matter.
What is that? So what is the poll actually saying then? Like, what is this? Do you know like what the popularity? Because in the past these polls have been like super high, right? Like 80, 90%, which is unimaginable that anybody would have that type of popularity. But what are some of the numbers that are coming?
Well, I'd remind you that George W. Bush's popularity went up into the 80s, right? When he did what?
Well, right after September 11th. Right after September 11th,
right after
the prelude to Iraq, that might have happened, right? So anytime there's a war and there's support, but afterwards, obviously, after a few months in, it was precipitous. The judgment that the American people kind of cast against him.
And I think there's good reason to believe that will happen in Russia, but there's this completely separate question, which is that polling data in any way valid? And there's two different parts of it, right? One is the idea that people might tell pollsters they support Putin just because they're so worried that somebody's actually keeping track of what they say. Mm-hmm. But the other, which I think is actually probably more compelling, is one of the things that we don't often see just in the headline numbers, and I would have to go look this up, is the response rate. Because I think there's some evidence that it's not so much that people are lying, it's that people who don't support Putin simply aren't answering the phone or aren't answering the questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a little bit of sense. Like, well, what incentive do they have to even speak what's on their mind if they're against Putin at this point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And if many of them aren't already fleeing, for that matter, the country in any way possible. So that being said, our last discussion last week was really on like what position Putin's in. We figured he's in a very precarious position. He's kind of being backed up against the corner. Is this the potential end of Putin? But this guy, he's going to find a way to do something. So now there's this gas pipeline. Nuclear threat was something that we talked about last time. Is this still, this is the big question, right? Let's talk about this.
I mean, I don't think we know too much that we didn't know last week, except that I talked to one of my friends in Kiev about this today. And he said that in Kiev, they are distributing information on what to do in case of a nuclear strike. Everybody is kind of stocking their bunkers, so to speak. Everybody's kind of getting their little survivalist bunker ready. And I asked him, I said, is it making people start to think maybe we should cut some deal that gives away some of our territory as a way of making sure this doesn't happen? And he was adamant. He was adamant that nobody's talking about that at all. Mm-hmm. And I think this is interesting because I think that if and when Putin does this, one of the things that will and somehow shape the Western response is the Ukrainian response. Mm-hmm. My friend also, and this isn't unique to my friend right there, but he talked about some things that people are speculating about, which is just kind of some different scenarios of nuclear weapons use. One is people talk about this Snake Island, where there was this incident early in the war where Ukrainian folks told the Russian warship to F off, that they might just sort of blow up that island something that wouldn't have too much effects on anybody in Ukraine itself, but would send a message that, yeah, we're serious about this. Mm-hmm. Other versions of that are they might blow it up way high in the atmosphere. Another version is that they would go after a big city like Kiev. And another version is that they would actually use it on the battlefield as a way of taking out a big bunch of Ukrainian troop formation, and that way, help the war effort. Now, the problem is if you blow up troops on the battlefield in territory that you're trying to take, the next thing you're doing, of course, is sending your troops into poisoned ground. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's using what's interesting about this, and going back to the 70s and 80s when we were talking about this stuff a lot, sort of using conventional weapons to win, using nuclear weapons to win a conventional war is kind of trickier than it seems. Because it tends to actually undermine whatever the goals of the war are. Right? So if the goal of the war is to occupy Ukraine, do you want to irradiate it? Maybe you do, maybe you don't.
Well, it's only twice in world history that nuclear weapons have actually been utilized.
That's right.
To great effect, by the United States. And so, it's a gamble in many ways, right? They don't know.
Absolutely.
And so in many ways, I guess the worry in general is if Putin is in such a position that he has to worry about losing the war, what is he capable of doing? Like frontline,
right.
I guess we don't know.
We don't know. My thinking has been back to sort of what I said about signaling earlier. I think it makes sense that before he dropped a nuclear weapon, he would do a lot more conventional escalation. He would bomb Kiev a lot more than he has and things like this. But, right, maybe one of the things he would do would be to bomb the Nord Stream pipeline. In other words, maybe what we saw this week is one of those steps. Again, if it were meant to be one of those steps, it would make a lot more sense to cop to the fact that they did it. Right?
If there is use of like a tactical nuke, what do you anticipate the world respond? What does a country like the United States do in this instance? What does NATO do?
We will issue some very stern condemnations.
That's it.
What else are we going to do? Right? I think the one thing everybody has to understand, right, is the United States, NATO, and so on are not going to nuclear war over Ukraine. Right? Nobody wants to say that, but of course it's obvious they don't need to. I think what would happen is I think the United States probably would say, okay, then the gloves are off in terms of what we supply Ukraine with. And maybe we'll let Ukraine start lobbying some of these HIMARS into Russia proper now. But once Russia starts dropping nuclear weapons on Ukraine,
This is not a Cold War scenario, though. This is not mutually assured destruction. This is not.
That's my point.
Yeah.
The United States could bomb Japan because we knew Japan didn't have nuclear weapons. Russia could bomb Ukraine because Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons. The danger for Russia, the danger for Russia is that somehow, right? There's always the worry that somehow, in an unpredictable way, it leads to World War III and we blow everything up. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing, it's hard to know exactly how this would turn out materially, but Russia as a pariah in the world system, Russia would be a pariah for the next 60, 80 years, right? An outcast. Does Putin care? I'm not sure at this point. I think I might have said this to you last week. I said it to somebody, he started out thinking he was going to be the second coming of Peter the Great. And, he looks more like now he's the second coming of Hitler. And if he uses a nuclear weapon against a bunch of innocent people in Ukraine, then he'll make Hitler look like a Sunday school teacher.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And like you said, there's so many other tactics that are likely to be at Putin's disposal. The bottom line is the ground war has not gone in any way that he has imagined. He imagined a 3-day war. It's drawn out for over 6 months. He's losing this battle. He's losing the reputation war for sure. And he's likely looking for other strategies at this point. And it just remains to be seen. We do have to worry, I guess, that the nuclear threat has increased though from what it was before.
Yeah, we do have to worry, and I think it's time. I mean, I actually think I think one of the actors who might be able to say something to him would be China. But China, on the other hand, China might think, boy, a little bit of a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States would leave us sitting pretty. So you just don't know what the incentives are.
There's just so many variables at play here. Yep. And, well, we'll continue talking about this. Anything else, yep, Paul, that you think is, very, very significant that's happened over the past week?
No, I think the big picture is the seriousness of this war has gone up by about 10 notches.
And it was already the most serious war.
It was already the biggest war in Europe since World War II. But it's gotten a lot scarier in the last week.
Is it going to change? I mean, you're publishing the second edition of your book, Ukraine and Russia. Is there? Are you waiting, holding off on that at this point to see what happens?
No, that's an interesting question. I mean, I hope we're all. I always used to joke, about people who write histories of nuclear war. There may not be anybody left to write the history. I hope we're all still here when the book is scheduled to come out early next year, but not yet. Which is. But if these troops go into the field and something big happens or something, we'll write about that.
Yeah, and we'll also be here in real time discussing this.
That's what I'm going to say. In a book, it's tough to stay up to date. That's why we do this.
Yeah,
because we can do it any day we want or any week we want.
And we will plan on doing that. Any major development, we will get on and talk about some of these significant things. So once again, Paul, thanks so much for joining this and your insights as always. Take care.
All right. See ya.